Welcome to Peacecast. I am U.S. Ambassador John W. McDonnell, now retired. I'm absolutely convinced that peace is possible, even in this troubled world of 2014. I believe that peace is real. And that's why I wanted to give the context of my background, because it wouldn't have happened without the background. And my experience all led up to that moment.
It didn't just come out of the blue.
Well, it did, but based on some ideas.
Right.
But I was in a position to help make it happen. And that's unique. It doesn't happen very often.
No.
Because I was government,
Right.
not private.
Right.
And you'll be amused that when I say I didn't tell the State Department about this.
I am amused. So you were moonlighting for peace.
Exactly.
Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and more about your background, how you came to the understandings that you have?
I started out a long time ago. I'm 92 years old now, so I have a long story to tell, but I'll make it very brief. As a young lawyer, admitted to practice in the state of Illinois, my first diplomatic assignment was Berlin, Germany. I arrived there on January 15th, 1947. Berlin was a disaster zone, totally destroyed by World War II. And I was assigned to the Allied Control Council, the four-power body governing Germany, Soviet, French, British, and American, for a year. Then I moved to Frankfurt, Germany, where I became district attorney for Frankfurt, Germany, which was rather unique in diplomatic history. And then moved to Bonn, where I was with the Allied High Commission. So I was 5.5 years in post-war Germany. And then I was posted as a diplomat to Paris, to the Marshall Plan. You've heard about the Marshall Plan. And it's the first time in history that a victorious nation helped to rebuild a defeated nation. And I was there for 2.5 years and helping to rebuild Western Europe. I then was assigned to Washington, D.C. after 8 years in Europe. I was here for 4 years, and then I went 8 years in the Muslim Middle East. I was assigned to 3 countries, Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan, for 4 years, where I did all kinds of fantastic projects, like building a railroad and a microwave system and so forth. And then was assigned for 4 years to Cairo, Egypt, when Mr. Nasser was president. Then back to Washington, D.C., I attended the National War College, with the senior training arm for the military and senior civilians, for a year at the National War College in Fort McNair in Washington, D.C., and graduated in class of 67, and then was assigned to the State Department, to the UN Bureau, and I worked for 8 years on UN Economic and Social Affairs, and then became an international civil servant for 4 years. I was Deputy Director General of the International Labor Organization in Geneva, and then back to Washington, and I was appointed ambassador twice by President Carter and twice by President Reagan, Democrat and Republican,
Right.
and worked for 6 years as ambassador on heading U.S. delegation to global economic and social conferences. Then I was assigned to the Center for the Study of Foreign Affairs at the Foreign Service Institute. Actually, it's just up the street. You can see my office sign there, it's called you can see it from here, actually. So it's a small world. I retired in 1987 after 4 years, and became a law professor at George Washington University, teaching international negotiation, and then became the first president of the Iowa Peace Institute, and was there for 3 years, and then back here in 1992, where I set up my institute on multi-track diplomacy. So I've been here for 22 years, focusing on conflict and peace building.
Speaking more personally now, what's peace to you?
Well, that's a tough one. It really is, because peace is so many things. To me, it's far more than just nonviolence, or it has to be integrated into the souls of the people. You can touch the heart of the person and make them realize that the enemy is also a human being with the same hopes and fears that you have. Then you begin to build a peace that lasts. And governments don't know how to do that. They think that if they sign a peace treaty, that's peace. That's not. You have to work with the people, and that's what we do. We only work with the people and help them build a peace process.
Tell us a little more about what it took back at the time when you were initiating the International Day of Peace, now recognized by the United Nations.
Well, that's quite a story. I was on the U.S. delegation to the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1981. And I was sitting in the delegates' lounge having a cup of coffee. Remember, I was an ambassador then. And the ambassador from Costa Rica, who was a friend, came up to me and sat down, and we had coffee together. And he said, you know, my president wants to establish an international year of peace. And I said, well, that's a great idea. But the General Assembly had decided a few years before that the odd number of years would be for national focus on items like water and disability, and the regular years were international world conferences. So I said, let me look at my calendar and say where the next open year is open. And it was 10 years from there. And I told Ambassador, that's 10 years from now. He said, oh my God, my president won't be around by that time. So he was very disappointed. He went away. Came back a week later, and we had another conversation. He said, my president really wants to do something about peace. Can't you help? And I said, well, let me think about it. And then I said, how about an International Day of Peace? Oh, he said, that's a fantastic idea. I said, well, what I will do, I will write a little resolution that your president has to come up from Costa Rica, take my resolution, make it his resolution, and present it as his idea to the General Assembly of the United Nations, and I'm sure they will adopt it unanimously. And that's exactly what happened. And so in November of 1981, the General Assembly passed that resolution, making the International Day of Peace the opening day of the General Assembly, which is the third week of September.
Right.
That's what I had on my original resolution.
Sure.
And it started in 1982.
So you make it sound like it was pretty easy once you put the right people together. Is that really how it happened?
Absolutely right. You always have to get the right people together who get inspired to do the thing that you hope they'll do. And because I did not tell the State Department about this idea, it happened very quickly, very, very smoothly.
So was that really all it took, getting the right people together at that time in order for the United Nations to agree to there being an International Day of Peace?
You put your ego behind you, you get a lot more done than having it out in front.
Absolutely. We understand that you're submitting a new proposal for an International Day of Peace at the United Nations. Can you tell me a little bit about how that differs from the one that's been in place all these years?
Well, you know, a lot happened over those decades. 20 years later, a new resolution was passed by the United Nations, making the date firm, making it September 21, which is the fall equinox. And the idea was that September 21 would be something that people could register with without having to move back and forth a year in and year out.
Yeah.
And so that was adopted by the General Assembly unanimously. And I've been involved in demonstrations about the International Day of Peace for many times over the years. I remember speaking on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial one time on September 21 about the International Day of Peace. We actually, in 2006, were able to organize a parade from here in Washington, D.C., down Massachusetts Avenue, from the mosque to the Indian Embassy, where there's a big statue of Gandhi. We had 500 people walking down that path. That's half a mile walk.
Okay.
And most recently, last September 21, I was invited to make a speech on the lawn of the Capitol. And I talked about the origins. And on that day, 500 million people in the world were celebrating the International Day of Peace. 500 million. That's a lot of people. But they were all people. They weren't governments. And so I decided, well, how do we make it possible for governments to get more directly involved in peace? And so I have written to the new president of Costa Rica, because they started the idea, and I've urged him to come to the General Assembly this fall and to take my draft resolution, which I've given to him, make it his own, and present it to the United Nations General Assembly. And that idea would be to make the International Day of Peace, September 21, a national holiday in every country of the world. And by spreading the word and making it official and getting governments involved, I'm hopeful for the future.
Is there some sort of petition or any way online that ordinary folks like us might be able to support this new version, if you will, of the International Day of Peace?
Well, everybody can push. There is a very interesting NGO called peacenow.com, and they have a petition out there which is supporting this idea, and people can sign up for that, peacenow.com, and get that out into the open. Now, I've also been working with a group called the Shift Network. The Shift Network started some 15 or 20 years ago. They now have 120,000 members, and they were celebrating, well, they have an hour-long program every week. And 100 days before this September 21, they began to get people to get organized and start planning for what to do, because they want to bring 1.5 billion people in the world to celebrate that International Day. And what I learned was that I heard about that program, but I wasn't on it. So I called them up and I said, hey, why don't you let me talk the next week? Because I started the darn thing.
Sure.
And they said, great. And so I did. And that's now on their website. And they've sent my resolution now out to their 120,000 members. So I'm hopeful for the future.
Well, now it's 23 years later since its inception. How do you feel, Ambassador, about the United Nations International Day of Peace?
I'm fascinated by it. I really think it's a great idea that the world has basically adopted, and now we have to push it forward and get people, once governments have made it a national holiday, then the people in that country can push them to do more about peace in their own particular country. So that's the long-term goal, is to make it a national holiday and then get every nation's people to push their governments to move in that general direction. That's what we try to do. That's how you build peace for the world.
You co-founded, and as I understand it, serve as the chairman for the Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy. Can you tell us a little bit about that organization, what its work is, and if there's any way for individuals to help with that work?
Oh, thank you for asking about that. Well, it started when I was still at the State Department. I wrote the first book on conflict resolution on something called Track 2 Diplomacy. And then I expanded that to 5 tracks, and then later at the Iowa Peace Institute to 9 tracks. And we call it a systems approach to peace. A system, that means all tracks have to work together. So track 1 is government, track 2 is non-government, track 3 is business, track 4 is citizen exchange programs, track 5 is education and training, track 6 is peace activism, people power, track 7 is religion, track 8 is funding, and that inner circle is track 9, which is communication, which links it all together. So that makes it a system. And once you have a system, then you can build a peace process that will actually last. So our goal is to work with the people. We only go where we are invited to go by the people. not by governments, by the people. And we go and we do something governments don't know how to do. We listen. Not just for an hour a day. When we were starting our work in Cyprus, we listened for 3 weeks. In Nepal, we listened for 3 weeks because we didn't know about the customs, the culture. We had to educate ourselves. And that's how the peace process is built. And then we ask people what their needs are. We don't tell them what their needs are. And we say we don't have money because we don't charge for our services overseas. We have to raise the money here to do the work overseas. And then when they say, yes, we want you, then we do something government don't do either. We make a 5-year commitment to that program. 5 years, not 5 months. So we have worked for 8 years in divided Cyprus. We worked for 8 years in Bosnia. We worked with the Dalai Lamas in 1990. We just finished our 18th training in India for his people. We worked in Nepal since 2001. We worked in the Republic of Georgia since 2001. These are long-term commitments. It takes time to build peace. You have to learn, well, as I tell people when I talk to them and lecture to them, particularly foreign service officers when they go abroad to a meeting, I say you've got to realize when you walk into an international conference, everybody in that room has a preconceived idea of who you are. They know that you're the most arrogant person in the world, the poorest listener in the world, and the most impatient person in the world. That's how you are perceived as a U.S. diplomat today. But you have to change that. And you can learn how to be less arrogant. You can learn how to be patient. And you can learn how to do the right thing. So that's what I urge them to do. And so that's how we started our institute. And I've been to 103 countries in my career, all 50 states of the United States, and all the provinces of Canada. So I know about people, I know about peace. And the last thing that I want to mention is, for us, the women are the peace builders of the world. They get it in every country I've worked in before the men do. So remember, the women are the peace builders.
Thank you, Ambassador. As we wrap up this interview for the PeaceCast 2014, are there any last things that you'd like to say to the actual and potential peacemakers out there?
I would like people to know my mantra. It's on the back of my calling card. It's very simple. What it says is, the only way to solve a conflict at any level of society to sit down face to face and talk about it. That's what I want people to remember. That's my message.
Thank you, Ambassador McDonald.
A pleasure.
Indeed.
You happy?
Yeah. Can I do that handshake one more time? All right.
What was that?
She wanted another handshake.